In the mid-1960s, Dr. Robert Riseborough was at Bodega Bay, California, working on a scientific problem. Why was the peregrine falcon disappearing as a species? Initially, it was thought that the herbicide DDT was responsible. A peregrine falcon egg found in Baja California was brought to the University of California Marine Laboratory at Bodega Bay for examination.
There were very high levels of the DDT compounds in that egg, which was surprising because it was a remote area of Baja California. But there were also high levels of these other chemicals, which we'd been seeing up until that time in other species of birds, fish up and down the coast, without knowing what they were. Because this particular species was disappearing, apparently for environmental reasons caused by pollution, it became very important to find out what these other chemicals were, and that led us to our discovery that they were PCBs.
Like DDT and dioxin, PCB is another petrochemical based on the benzene ring. It is derived from the binding together of two such rings. The rings are changed with heat and bind together to become a biphenyl. Varying amounts of chlorine are added to make a polychlorinated biphenyl, otherwise known as PCB.
PCB is a kind of case history for many of the mistakes that the petrochemical industry has made. In this case, we've got pretty good records. The first plant to produce PCB began to operate around 1930 in Anniston, Alabama. One company now manufactured PCB, Monsanto. We now know that within the first 2 years after that plant operated, 23 out of the 24 workers in the plant were seriously ill with chloracne. By 1933 or so, the Monsanto company knew from the effects on their own workers that they were dealing with a very dangerous substance. 10 years later, they were told by a health agency that human contact with PCB should be avoided. 30 years ago, it would have been prudent for Monsanto to give up the manufacture of PCB. They did not, and in that time, enormous amounts of it were disseminated in the environment. And I think that the industry failed to respond to this signal of the toxicity of their material.
Despite its dangers, the manufacture of PCB grew to gigantic proportions, a total of 1.5 billion tons from the time it was first made. The main use initially was for power transformers. Heat and fire-resistant properties of PCB made it of special value for such devices. Later, PCB was found useful in entirely new ways in making fluorescent light bulbs and TV sets. Through large-scale manufacture, it also was able to replace existing products such as carbon paper. Kyushu, Japan, was the location of the first incident involving PCBs in public health. In early 1968, PCB was accidentally mixed with yusho, the rice oil used for cooking in that part of Japan. At least 1,300 people were affected with problems ranging from chloracne to swelling of eyes, eyelids, and body joints. The same types of problems reported to industry 35 years earlier. There has been an abnormal incidence of miscarriages and stillbirths in that part of Kyushu. Babies born of victims have had some of the same problems as their parents. One baby may have gotten the disease from milk nursed from its mother, who had eaten the poisoned oil. Halfway around the world, New York's Long Island, and more evidence of the widespread danger. In the early 1970s, scientists began to find PCB in terns, which they concluded may be responsible for the deformities in newly hatched birds, and the failure of some eggs to hatch at all.
One thing we've learned from PCB is that the world has become very, very small. We've been measuring PCB in the Arctic. We've gone to Antarctica to measure it in snows. We've been measuring it in oceans over the world. 20 years ago, when we went to these places, they were remote from human activities, and that's not true anymore. And all parts of the world are now subject to pollution that may come from any industrialized country.
Just center it on your breath.
PCB has become so widespread, it is now found in the milk of nursing mothers throughout the world. Scientists in North Carolina are studying how much PCB passes from mother to child and to see how dangerous that may be for the child's health. In other human milk studies, 7 times more PCB has been found than what is permitted in cow's milk for human consumption.
You want to go back over to Mommy?
The milk samples are sent from North Carolina to Ralltech, a Wisconsin laboratory, where the contents are analyzed. Ralltech is able to detect trace amounts, minute quantities of the substance, by using new scientific techniques and instruments which have helped spur the detection of dangerous toxics in people's bodies.
In most human beings, you run about 10 parts per million PCBs in the fatty tissue. That's a rough guess. If they were to analyze fatty tissue from you right now, it would run about 10 parts per million. No ifs, ands, buts, or maybes.
Can you look at me?
The effect of small quantities of PCB in babies is not yet known, but the North Carolina scientists have started to look into that also. They are examining newborn babies to see if the presence of PCB in their bodies may be connected to any abnormalities in their motor abilities and response to external stimuli. The infants are checked periodically up to 6 years old to try to learn if new abnormal developments occur that might be attributed to PCB, which may accumulate in their bodies over the years. The study is scheduled for completion in 1986, but there are other results from Dr. Allen's studies.
Although we are not aware of any serious complications in the general population as a result of this exposure, there are strong indications that it is a carcinogenic agent and possibly a mutagenic agent. In addition, there are indications of reproductive abnormalities. These are subtle effects and would not be obvious unless one were looking for them. In our studies with monkeys, we have not found a safe level in the polychlorinated biphenyl mixtures. We have fed levels as low as 0.5 parts per million in one particular group and 25 parts per billion in another group, 3 times per week in the diets over a period of years, and found deleterious effects.
One way people get PCB into their bodies is through food. In 1972, New York State scientists found alarmingly high levels of PCB in Hudson River fish, normally eaten by people. The PCB was coming from Hudson Falls and Fort Edwards in upstate New York. General Electric plants there discharged a total of 500,000 pounds of PCB into the river over several years through leakage or spills. GE was eventually fined $4 million, although the current estimate is that the total cost to remove PCB from the river will be over $200 million. This incident led to congressional action. The sale and manufacture of PCB was banned as of 1979.
The action was taken far too late. PCB is stable, and most of the PCB that's been produced is in the environment, contaminating every living thing. Everywhere you look, there is PCB. You have to understand, for example, you go fishing in the Great Lakes now. You've got to be sure, if you want to avoid eating PCB, to cut the fat out of the fish. And the fact of the matter is that the Monsanto company by manufacturing PCB and disseminating it for 40 years or so in the United States without being aware of what they were really doing to the environment and to every living thing in the environment have caused a problem, the answer to which they don't know and we don't know.
PCB has not only been an environmental problem, it also has created major economic disruption. At Monsanto headquarters in St. Louis, Dan Bishop.
When we were convinced that they were indeed accumulating in the environment, we began a system of restricting sales of the products to only the electrical industry, where they were used in sealed systems for capacitors and transformers, and offered the very real safety requirements that were needed in areas where you have large populations of people.
PCB was manufactured by Monsanto when they discovered that they could sell it. They discovered they could sell it because it invaded markets of previous substances. You can go down the list of the major products of the petrochemical industry, and you discover that in almost every instance, they do not provide a new service, but substitute for a pre-existing material that provided the service of clothing or furniture or construction material. Now, there's a very good reason for that. The economy of synthetic materials such as plastics, synthetic fibers, detergents, they are economical only when they're produced in very large amounts. They're made by automated processes, a whole series of pipes, very few workers. So you have to spend a great deal of money to build a petrochemical plant. And you don't get your money back unless you sell an awful lot of synthetic fibers, detergents, plastics.
The economic advantages of mass production can eliminate competition. This traps both the public and the producer with the substituted product.
We would have liked to have gotten out of the business in the late 60s, because once you cut back production, as we did, to restrict it only to the electrical uses, there really wasn't any viable business to speak of. Plants operate at maximum efficiency, and when you reduce the amount of material being made by 50%, which is what we did, you reduce the economics, the realities of the manufacture of the product substantially. We stayed in the business because we really didn't have any choice. If we would have unilaterally withdrawn, there would have been widespread power blackouts in the country. There would have been transportation disruptions. Even the EPA recognized this, and Russell Train, the then administrator, asked us to continue manufacturing products till the industry could find suitable replacement products.
Now, I don't doubt that there are economic difficulties that are caused by the necessity of withdrawing petrochemical agents such as PCB from the market. But I'd like to point out there were economic difficulties for the manufacturers of the goods that the PCB substituted for. In other words, both times, coming in and going out, the market is disrupted. And I think what this tells us is that the economic force of the petrochemical industry is so large that we should certainly examine each new product well in advance to find out if it is going to be acceptable from the environmental and health point of view before we allow the industry to disrupt the economy of their competitors in the first instance, then disrupt the economy of the people who are using their product when later on it has to be withdrawn.
General Electric's PCB problem helped precipitate passage of a landmark law called TSCA, the Toxic Substance Control Act of 1976. The first thing TSCA has done is to make an inventory of all the chemicals already in commercial use, 50,000 of them. Now, EPA is required to decide which of these chemicals should be given top priority for safety tests. How can this enormous job get done?
There are 50,000 or so chemicals that have been introduced in commerce that we're using, and very few of these have been tested to see if they're carcinogens or mutagens. And to test those chemicals is practically impossible if we do it by just measuring cancer in people, because there are 20 to 30-year lags, and it's very hard to establish cause and effect in people after this long time period, and 25% of us are getting cancer. So it's just very hard to track down in people, and by the time you track it down, it's sort of too late. And to do it in animals is important, but we can only do about 150 or 200 animal cancer tests a year because it's so expensive.
Dr. Ames has developed a new test. Instead of taking 2 or 3 years and spending $250,000 on an animal cancer test, he developed a simple test that can be done in a day or two and costs less than $500. The chemical in question is mixed with a special strain of bacteria and incubated overnight. Examining the way the bacteria develop can then show if the chemical has the ability to cause mutations. If it does, there is a strong chance the chemical could cause cancer. Tosca could use short-term tests like this, but to date, 3 years after passage of the law, the testing program has not started.
There's no question that we're going to keep on reading about the carcinogen of the week for a long time, because there are all this backlog of chemicals that have never been tested. And now people are much more aware of it. Chemical companies are aware that they just can't make 10 billion pounds a year of a chemical and not know whether it's a carcinogen.
Tosca is also supposed to regulate new products. Industry is required to notify EPA before going on the market. EPA then has 90 days to object if it finds the product unreasonably dangerous. Can EPA properly evaluate dangers of a new chemical in that time? Particularly when all data on hazards come from industry's own tests?
The chemical industry knows more about their products than anyone else does. They have the best equipment, they have the best qualified people, and it is in their interest to market safe products. It is good business to market safe products. It is not good business to market dangerous or hazardous products in an irresponsible way. And the company, I submit, that does that isn't going to last very long in our current society.
You can't leave it up to the person who might profit from something to conduct a test. Experience has proven that the test results will be what the person conducting them wants them to be. But it's no big complicated problem to have the federal government set up an apparatus where we know the test results and where they're done under very controlled circumstances.
It's going to be a considerable burden. And when I say burden, I am not talking just about financial. I think the probably most serious burden that will be felt by the consumer and by the industry and by the economy is not one of dollars expended in order to do testing, but rather the impact on innovation, which is the lifeblood of industries based on technology like the chemical industry.
There's a lot of rhetoric in that, and very little facts. We're concerned about innovation. The Congress was concerned about innovation. In fact, Congress was concerned that we as bureaucrats did not inadvertently stifle innovation. They wanted us to stifle innovation of dangerous chemicals and to keep dangerous chemicals off the market or to restrict their use in some way. So if that's the kind of innovation we're stifling, that's fine. But they didn't want us to inadvertently stifle innovation of useful chemicals that people in our society need and think are worthwhile. And I have yet to see hard, factual examples from the industry or firm data on how we could be stifling innovation.
Environmentalists contend all new chemicals should be proven safe before used. But when Tosca was passed, Congress essentially mandated that new chemicals are safe until proven dangerous by EPA. The result today? Long delays before EPA decisions will be implemented.
It takes time to build a case against chemicals. And we know that in every instance, virtually every instance, we're going to be sued on whatever we do, and we want to win. Federal regulatory programs have been plagued by a history of losing in court, and therefore wasting a lot of work that went into their regulatory efforts and having to go back and do things over again. We're faced with tens of thousands of chemicals, with dozens of major companies and hundreds of minor companies, and with a seeming endless supply of high-paid Washington lawyers facing us on the other side?
Well, essentially, the industry is a very powerful industry, and certainly compared to the United States Congress, I mean, it's like Lilliputians. I mean, the Congress will always back off, and so will the White House in dealing with the oil and chemical industry. I mean, it's just not even a match. They don't belong in the same ballpark. The Congress will always back down in any confrontation with stringent enforcement of the chemical industry. I mean, you're dealing with global corporations, and I think you have to be extremely naive to think that a state apparatus could meaningfully intervene in the operations of corporations.
It's a good thing that TSCA has passed, but what has to happen now is that it has to be enforced. And it's been moving very slowly. There are enormous numbers of chemicals that have to be reviewed, rules made, procedures established, and very little of that has been done. And it's also clear that TSCA is not going to clean up situations like PCB that have already occurred and have contaminated the environment. If the chemical industry really openly collaborated with the government in developing good procedures for enforcing the rules, I think TSCA could have a very big effect soon. But as far as I can tell, the industry is going to squeeze every loophole out of that situation that they can. And it's going to take a long time before TSCA becomes effective, I think.
Meanwhile, we are left with a legacy of 50,000 already produced chemicals and a fundamental problem of how to dispose of them safely. 90% now go into unsafe sites or are dumped illegally. PCB is one example.
The PCB problem is far from solved. Matter of fact, it may actually get worse as the years go on, because although laws have been passed which would allow us to take care of some of the PCB problems, the government hasn't taken effective steps to implement those laws. Consequently, the use of PCBs continues, the disposal continues in ways which are not proper. The levels in food which have been permitted to be high for years have never been reduced. There is no standard that limits the presence of PCBs in your drinking water, no standard that limits air pollution from PCBs. In fact, our environment continues to be contaminated with PCBs, and people continue to be exposed.
This is what happened with PCB last summer in North Carolina. Ernest Fuller.
At approximately 11:15 the night of August the 2nd, I was traveling a rural highway similar to this one when I discovered a very distinct odor, similar to that of mothballs, very pungent, very strong, very irritating to the eyes and to the nose. I also could see a strange substance glistening in the headlights along the side of the road, similar to a very heavy dew.
Fuller took some grass clippings to a state government laboratory in Raleigh.
No one at that point had any knowledge of what the substance might be. No one that I talked to had ever encountered such a substance. We had the substance analyzed, and it turned out to be PCB, polychlorinated biphenol.
Between 15 and 30,000 gallons of PCB oil had been dumped along 212 miles of rural North Carolina roads. Part of it was dumped on a highway that goes past the house and farm owned by T. Mitchell Langdon.
On the morning of August 2nd, we got up and noticed one of the worst odors that I've ever been in contact with. It was a nauseous, sweet, death kind of smell. So we had about 25 or 30 migrant workers working in the tobacco fields. We started about 7 o'clock, and by 10 o'clock that morning, every single one of the folks that were working for me was sick, without an exception. Were vomiting and nauseous. The folks the criminals really, because that's exactly what they are, they're criminals of the lowest caliber who perpetrated this act, just committed a little bit of murder against each resident who lives along the contaminated areas. They have done irreversible harm to the health of those residents who live along the highways where this chemical was dumped, and also they have damage the health of the unborn, the posterity of the community.
1 mile of the PCB oil was scraped off the side of the road and gathered up by state officials. That left 211 miles still contaminated. Since no one in the state wanted any of this material, an argument developed over where it all could be put. The first mile was piled into a temporary fenced-off site in Warren County. EPA intended to allow the rest to be put in a nearby landfill, even though it would be only 10 feet from the nearest underground water, thus violating the government's own recommended safety margin of 50 feet.
This hearing is being sponsored by the Environmental Protection Agency. You in the audience may make...
EPA held a hearing in Warren County in cooperation with the state of North Carolina. Over 1,000 people showed up at the local armory.
I ask that you observe the 5-minute rule that we have publicized for the meeting.
I am here to give you evidence of how the state and the EPA have discredited themselves and shown themselves to be unworthy of our trust. Since the beginning of what has become this PCB horror, neither the state nor the EPA can be commended for the way it has handled the dealings in this matter.
EPA estimates that 300 to 400 million...
Every one of the local residents who testified objected to the plan.
And I think that every member of this community and this county and those who would not favor PCB to be dumped on Warren County because of these specific facts that we have right here before us tonight, because of the health of us today and of your children's tomorrow, we need to protect our children from this source of PCB. And in behalf of my membership, the Cold Spring Baptist Church, which consists of more than 400 members, we are bitterly against PCB. And we will go to the letter of the law to keep PCB from coming into the Warren County community. Thank you, sir.
Despite all the local opposition, on May 25, 1979, federal EPA approved the landfill site in Warren County. Wilsonville, a tiny community in southern Illinois, was one place where it seemed PCB could be disposed of both legally and safely. A firm called Earthline bought Wilsonville's parkland and started hauling in chemical wastes. Local people were alarmed when they found out. Not only were PCBs being driven up their town's one major street, they also knew that the dump site was on top of abandoned and possibly unstable mine shafts. Nevertheless, EPA evaluated and approved the site at the request of the state of Illinois.
Therefore, when Senator Vince DiMuzio brought to our attention that Earthline Corporation was burying 5,000 drums of polychlorinated biphenyls, PCB, a cancer-causing factor, and other hazardous toxic waste in the landfill here in Wilsonville, there was no alternative for us but to speak out and demonstrate against the social injustice manifested against the people of Wilsonville.
Most of the scientific information that we've had made available to us, as well as that we put together ourselves in making our applications for a permit, and when the permits were granted to this site by the controlling agencies, leads us to believe the site is as safe as one can be. I would hope that the people who object to the site would make same type of investigation. I think they'll be convinced that their fears are unfounded.
The industrial production of the United States, just as a matter of course, produces industrial waste, some of which is toxic, some of which is hazardous. We've got to deal with that issue. You've got to have facilities that are designed and operated properly to handle those wastes. The public, which perceives this as a threat with good reason. They don't want to have a site like that next to them. I don't blame them. I wouldn't want to have such a site near me either.
These people that think this is so great, why don't they put it in their own yard? Take it to the peanut farm over there, put it in his place.
No one was ever told that hazardous or dangerous or toxic materials were to have a lasting and final burial here in Wilsonville. We weren't told that the U.S. EPA and the state EPA had considered this site as one of the two, I think, as I recall correctly, in the nation for the burial of such materials.
Why weren't they told? I don't know. For one thing, it's very difficult when you're in that business to know in advance what type of materials will be handled there. The case of PCBs going to Wilsonville, for example, was a rather urgent situation. It was a PCB spill in another state. EPA cleaned up that spill on a rather emergency basis. You now have the material that you cleaned up, and you've got to take that somewhere.
Wilsonville went to court and won. The judge ruled all the waste already brought in had to be removed because the townspeople had not been involved in the initial decision to place the dump site in their community. The decision is being appealed.
I think that the most important point that came about through the efforts of the village of Wilsonville in the court case is that we now point up to the nation, to industry, to the public officials, the fact that we no longer will accept the principle that some must suffer for the benefit of the majority.
I was sure glad to find out that a small group like Wilsonville that was misled by a big corporation, that we were able to fight them and whip them. So far we haven't got them whipped, but we're still fighting them.
New EPA rules will require public hearings before a hazardous waste site permit can be issued, but government can still override local opposition.
We have a situation that is somewhat of an impasse right now. I think the public has to be convinced that the technology for managing hazardous waste properly, does exist, and that the risk, which is always there, is very low.
Love Canal, Niagara, New York. 237 families evacuated. The neighborhood an official disaster area. When the American public learned what happened here, the problems of toxic chemicals finally became an issue that reached us all. EPA identified nearly 100 chemical compounds that were buried here over 25 years ago by Hooker Chemicals and Plastic Company, a subsidiary of Occidental Petroleum. The chemicals were placed in the central part of the site. In 1953, Hooker sold it to the local Board of Education for a token fee of $1. Modest homes were built nearby, with backyards facing the landfill. And a school was constructed in 1954, with its playground directly on top of the old canal. Hooker says they warned the school board of the risks of building on the site, but as early as 1958, Hooker learned chemicals were leaching out of the landfill. Hooker did not alert residents because they believed it was not their responsibility. The school closed in 1978, and children like Michael Gibbs had to be bused to other facilities. By then, some residents in and near Love Canal believed they had critical health problems connected to the leaching chemicals. Michael, his parents, and a younger sister still live 1 block from the evacuated site. Lois Gibbs.
Since he attended the school, he developed many, many illnesses, respiratory problems, liver problems, urinary problems, ear infections continually. His white blood count went down to almost 0, and he was hospitalized for it. He got so sick in the hospital because he had no resistance that eventually I had to bring him home and isolate him at home. It's just, an everyday thing in this area.
People never talked about things like that before. It was like, if your child had something and my child had something, you wouldn't tell it right here. Now everybody's finally coming out and saying that my child has this and that, and it's finally coming out.
This is the Love
Like
Canal
Bonnie Hill in
area.
Oregon, Lois Gibbs did her own survey of the Love Canal area.
What these are is stream beds that at one time crossed the canal in historically wet areas which have collected contamination. On these old stream beds or historically wet areas, you find birth defect rates in the last 4 years of 56%. You know, these are children with extra parts, extra fingers, 3 ears, double row of teeth, club feet, etc., etc. The miscarriage rate, again, is 25% above normal. You know, there's definitely a cause and effect. We've documented it. We've submitted it to the health department. Unfortunately, the health department said it was gathered unscientifically and that basically it's housewife data, and therefore they've thrown it out. But I believe there is definitely a cause and effect. Our problem is trying to prove this.
The New York State Health Commissioner is responsible for deciding whether the health of Love Canal area residents is being endangered. His decision has been closely watched by Hooker President Bruce Davis.
In the Love Canal area, he's only given an order to evacuate pregnant women and children under 2 because of statistical evidence that indicates there may be a slightly higher risk associated with miscarriages and birth defects in the area. To date, he has publicly stated that there is no evidence that can be connected to the chemicals in Love Canal to any health problems in that area.
Some of the evacuees and nearby residents formed the Love Canal Homeowners Association. They believe living a block or 2 from the evacuated area is still dangerous because the underground stream beds go beyond the fenced-off streets. They are pressing for a larger-scale evacuation because they fear for their health and that of children older than 2 years of age.
Up until last summer, John was a healthy little boy, and suddenly last June he began swelling up. At first, when I took him to the doctors, they thought that he was had an allergy of some sort. However, no matter what medication was given to him, this swelling was persistent. And finally, on the 1st of July, he was diagnosed as having nephrosis. It's a disease of the kidneys whereby the kidneys don't hold back the larger proteins and they're filtered out into the urine. So John was hospitalized at that time and treated with prednisone, which is a normal treatment for nephrosis. He responded to the drug and was sent home after about 3 weeks. John had another relapse in mid-August. We had him readmitted to Children's Hospital on a Monday, and on Wednesday, suddenly without warning, he passed away. This was a shock to us because all along they had been telling us that John would be fine, there was nothing to worry about. Indeed, they said it was the best disease any child could have. That if a child had to have any disease, this was something that was curable. The state of New York has been moving the children under 2 years old from this area specifically because there are immunological suppressants in the canal, and the immunological responses are developing under age 2. Now, John was our only child who was born in the Love Canal area, the only one who was here under the age of 2 when these responses were developing. John was a beautiful, intelligent child. I know every mother, father that's lost a child will say that. But he was a lovable child. He was a child that tried to stay well under all circumstances. He was put on a salt-free diet, and for a 7-year-old to be as cautious as he was because he didn't want to go back to the hospital. And still, I was powerless at that time, and I didn't realize that I was powerless, that no matter what I did in trying to take care of him, cooking everything was salt-free and trying to prevent infections because they told me it was infections that would harm him, that all the time the chemicals were sitting out there in the backyard.
But we don't believe we have a legal liability. We made that point very clear. But you just don't stop at legal liabilities. You have to go beyond that point. And we think that there is a moral responsibility that Hooker has in Love Canal, and that is to do whatever is possible to expedite the cleanup of the area and get the area returned to its original condition as quickly as possible. And that's the program that we embarked on back in 1976 as soon as we learned there was a problem out there. We don't know the extent of the problem, but as soon as we get the data completed, then we will have a program that we will get approved by the state, and we'll move forward with it. You know, we're on top of the situation. We know what we're doing, and we're going to get the job done.
That job also involves other hooker landfills around Niagara. This one is 4 times larger than Love Canal. Chemicals are leaching out and running untreated from the site into Bloody Run Creek. Hooker admits dioxin is there as well as in Love Canal. There is no aquatic life in Bloody Run. It flows into the Niagara River, which in less than a mile downstream becomes one of the world's best-known polluted vistas.
For the sake of our 2 other children and the other children around here, I'm going to have to forget what my grief is and our sorrow and just go in for a good fight and try and relieve some of the frustrations and anger that we have now.
The frustrations and anger of other Love Canal residents exploded at a hearing in February 1979. It was when the State Health Commissioner announced that the evacuation of residents would be limited to families of pregnant women and children under 2, while a blue ribbon panel studied the situation another 6 months.
You don't think I'm as concerned about my 3-year-old as I am of this baby I'm carrying? I can identify with these people. And I don't blame them for being angry. I'm glad that I'm going to be leaving, but I want to see these people leave, too. Why can't you just move everybody for once? We're going to go through another 6 months, and then finally you're going to say, oh, well, then from the age of 2 to 5, and then it's going to be from the age of 5 to 10. Well, come on, smarten up. We can spend money overseas. We can spend money, bring dead bodies home. Yay!
You're assholes! You're just a pile of assholes! You're not human! You have no heart! Human people would not do this to people! You can't throw down lives like this! You're destroying us! We're not people to you, we're numbers! Well, it's gotta stop! We're
I want to know if I can go home and live with my mother and father again. I had to go to my grandmother's house. I want to know if I'll be able to grow up to be a normal man.
I maintain we've crossed the threshold, and from one era into another. We're in an era now of genetic confrontation. Not only are we damaging present-day workforce, we are well on our way in damaging future generations.
Industry should find better places, not in a place like ours, places where it won't interfere with no human rights or human life or anything like that.
Richard is going to have to take into consideration that when he comes of age, he's going to have to make certain decisions that may or less, not allow him to go on and live a carefree, productive life. He's going to have to consider that maybe if this thing happened to him, will it happen to his son or his daughter?
I don't think that people should just have to passively accept what is being done to them by other powers that be.
We're going to have to reassemble. The struggle is just starting, and they're just not listening to us, We're going to have to get a lot more forceful.
The material on this video cassette is protected by copyright. It is for private use only, and any other use, including copying, reproducing, or performance in public, in whole or in part, is prohibited by law.